Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. On December 23, 1927, the downtown area of the small north-central Texas town of Cisco in Eastland County was busy with last-minute shoppers getting ready for Christmas. Situated about 100 miles west of Fort Worth, Cisco was a bustling center that had thrived off the back of the Texas oil boom in the mid to late 1910s. It had begun life as a railroad town and continued to prosper thanks to coal mining. The town of around 8,000 residents was enjoying unseasonably warm weather, according to the Fort Worth Weekly. And given the time of year, it didn't seem out of place to see Santa Claus ambling down Cisco's main street, known as Avenue D. For the town youngsters, the unexpected delight of jolly old St. Nick walking down the street at midday brought great unanticipated delight. As the man in the red suit strolled along, he greeted excited children, waving and gently patting them on the head as he passed. A 6-year-old girl across the street with her mother was so excited she pleaded with her mom for them to follow Santa to see where he was going, and her mother agreed. Santa couldn't pause to chat, though. Like everyone else, he had things to do that day, and his first stop was at Cisco's First National Bank. Welcome to episode 205, the Santa Claus Bank Robbery. Underneath the festive attire, dressed in street clothes, was 24-year-old Cisco local and unemployed convicted armed robber Marshall Fields Ratliff. And he wasn't filled with Christmas spirit. That day, he was intent not on giving, but taking from the First National Bank. And just like Santa, Marshall had helpers on standby to help him pull it off. Waiting outside in an alley beside the bank, in a stolen dark blue Buick, were 31-year-old Henry Helms, 22-year-old Robert Hill, and 32-year-old Lewis Elmore Davis. The men had arrived in town after driving over 150 miles from Wichita Falls late the night before, having stolen the Buick and made their journey drunk on moonshine. They had an audacious plan. Marshall and his brother Lee had initially conspired to rob the bank some months before. They weren't strangers to being on the wrong side of the law. In 1926, they were convicted for another armed robbery in Valera and sentenced to 18 years in prison. But when they were both pardoned by Governor Miriam Ferguson after just a year and were unable to find work in the oil fields, Marshall and Lee made their way to Wichita Falls, where they lived in a rooming house. Things went awry for the brothers when Lee committed another armed robbery in the fall of 1927 and returned to prison. Marshall decided to recruit 2 of his Huntsville State Penitentiary buddies, Henry Helms and Robert Hill, as well as a safecracker. By mid-December, the plan was set to rob the Cisco First National. But a week later, the safecracker came down with the flu. So Marshall roped in his brother-in-law, Lewis Davis, who, unlike the others, had no criminal record. But the lure of a sizable cut of the money was too good to resist for the father of 3. Marshall knew he couldn't walk into the bank wearing any old disguise, hoping to get away with robbery. He was known in Cisco, where his mother formerly ran a cafe. Back in Wichita Falls, Marshall persuaded his landlady to loan him a Santa Claus costume she had made for her husband, reassuring her he would have it back to her in time for Christmas Day. On the morning of December 23rd, after the group arrived in Cisco, Marshall put on the red suit and crouched down on the floor of the Buick. His accomplices led him out a few blocks away from the bank to walk the rest of the way. They then continued on into the alleyway alongside the bank building to await their cue. After Marshall let his accomplices in the alley know he had arrived, he strolled into the lobby of the red brick one-story bank. Enthralled children followed him, like a festive Pied Piper. Around 16 people were inside, including customers and staff, with some at the teller's windows. Cashier Alex Spears called out a friendly, "Hello, Santa," but got no response from the bearded man as he made his way to a desk where customers were writing deposit slips. A follow-up greeting was also ignored. Without warning, Robert, Henry, and Lewis, who had followed Marshall inside but were all undisguised, suddenly pulled out their guns. According to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Robert confronted the cashier and a customer he was speaking with, telling them it was a stick-up. Frances Blasingame was the 6-year-old girl who, along with her mother, were among those who had followed Santa into the bank. But they had no idea what awaited them and were now trapped, thanks to Lewis menacingly blocking the front door. Or so they thought. Thinking quickly, Mrs. Blasingame grabbed her daughter. Bravely running through the bookkeeper's office and ignoring the shouts of the robbers to stop or be shot, they ran out a side door and down the alley towards the police department nearby. Upon being alerted to the robbery in progress, Police Chief George Bitt Bedford, Deputy George Carmichael, and Officer Ronald Reddy sprang into action. The 59-year-old Chief Bedford was an imposing man standing 6'4" and had 25 years on the job. Grabbing riot guns, the officers swiftly made their way to the bank, with Chief Bedford taking up position near the top of the alley near the bank's front door. His fellow officers manned an alley running perpendicular to the bank's rear, according to local newspaper editor Boyce House. As word quickly spread outside up and down Avenue D, it was a literal call to arms for the citizens of Cisco. In the 1920s, bank robberies throughout small-town Texas were occurring at a rate of up to 4 times a day. In response, just months before, the Texas Bankers Association had announced a $5,000 reward for anyone who killed an armed robber. That's over $88,000 today. But there was no reward for a robber who was captured alive. So it's no surprise that Ciscoans, determined to either nab themselves the reward, completely fed up with armed robbers' rampant lawlessness, or both, converged upon the bank from a safe distance. After all, while people's lives were at risk, the opportunity to score a quick $5,000 was too good to resist. Stores carrying firearms were selling out of guns as people on the street wanted in on the action to take down the men terrorizing their community. Inside the bank, Marshall had barged through to the teller's cage, where he took a pistol from a drawer inside. Henry shoved customer Oscar Clyott out of the way at the counter, ordering the cashier, Jewel Poe, to open the bank vault. Pulling a potato sack out from under his Santa suit, Marshall hurriedly stuffed $12,200, almost $217,000 today, and $150,000 in bonds, worth over $2.6 million today, into his bag and emptied cashier drawers, while his accomplices herded terrified bank staff and customers into the bookkeeping office. Henry was particularly frightening, as he held an automatic weapon in each hand, threatening the hostages not to look at their captors. When Marshall emerged from the vault, the gunfire started. Apparently seeing someone peering in through one of the windows, Henry fired a shot. Robert then fired multiple times into the ceiling to show the terrified hostages the gang meant business. Armed citizens waiting outside the bank responded in kind, unleashing a hail of bullets on the building. The robbers knew time was running out to make their escape and needed to make a quick exit. As the gang made their way to the side door and out into the alley with the hostages, gunfire erupted in a dramatic shootout with Chief Bedford, Officers Carmichael and Reddy's, and the public. The robbers returned fire, and in the melee, 6 hostages were wounded. It was hard to say whether they were shot by the robbers, police, or the public. The wounded included 42-year-old cashier Alex Spears, who was shot in the jaw, customer Oscar Clyott, who was struck in the foot, and 22-year-old Harvard student Marion Kaysen, who was shot in his leg, 28-year-old laborer Pete Rutherford, 33-year-old Brady Boggs, and cafe owner R.L. Day. Chief Bitt Bedford was shot 5 times by Henry Helms as he attempted to prevent the men from passing him at the top of the alley near the street. Deputy George Carmichael was also struck by Henry, sustaining a serious head wound. The 4 robbers knew they couldn't take a whole group of hostages with them in making their escape, so instead they chose 2 girls, 12-year-old Laverne Comer and 10-year-old Emma Mae Robertson. Using the girls as human shields while the gang ran towards the Buick with the loot in hand, the men bundled their hostages into the vehicle. But the robbers didn't escape unscathed. Robert was shot in the arm, while Marshall was struck in the leg and chin. But Lewis Davis was also wounded badly and had lapsed into unconsciousness by the time he was laid on the floor in the rear of the Buick. Ironically, he had only agreed to the robbery on the condition that there would be no shooting. As the bullet-riddled Buick took off, Officer Reddies, who had managed to escape uninjured, made a dash back to the police department for a rifle before hitching a ride with a motorist to continue the chase. Hopes of a speedy getaway were thwarted as a comedy of errors proceeded to play out. It seems it had occurred to none of the men that after their road trip from Wichita Falls, the Buick would need more gas. Realizing the tank was dangerously low, they turned right out of the alley and sped south on Avenue D. With a flat tire, thanks to several crack shots by a mailman's .45 Colt, they pulled over. Marshall and Henry rushed out into the road, holding up an Oldsmobile at gunpoint, driven by 14-year-old Woody Harris, who had driven his parents and grandmother in from Rising Star. As the Harrises ran for safety into a nearby house, the robbers manhandled their two young hostages, Lewis and the money, into the Oldsmobile, all the while dodging bullets, which whizzed and pinged around them as incensed locals and law enforcement gave chase. Robert was wounded during the relentless gunfire. But to start a car, you need keys, and the ones for the Oldsmobile were safely still with the quick-thinking Woody Harris. The bumbling and frustrated men hurried back to the Buick with their hostages, leaving the comatose Lewis, who would slow them down, in the back of the Oldsmobile. He was later taken to a Fort Worth hospital. As the men forced the last drop of gas out of the Buick, they fired shots back at a vehicle pursuing them. Even if they hadn't planned on an empty tank, they had brought with them a deterrent in the form of nails, which they tossed out into the road to disable their pursuers' tires. The men only made it a few miles to the edge of town before they ran out of gas and decided to flee on foot over a fence and into the undergrowth. Laverne and Emma Mae were left cowering in the Buick unharmed with the bloody Santa suit as the men ran for their lives. But by the time they felt free and clear of the angry townsfolk and law enforcement, they realized it wasn't just Lewis they had left behind. Thankfully for authorities, the robbers had left behind all the stolen cash and securities too. According to the Waxahachie Daily Light, the proceeds were returned to the bank, which was damaged by at least 200 bullet holes. The biggest manhunt in Texas to date was on, led by 31-year-old Ranger Captain Tom Hickman, and authorities in the surrounding areas were about to take up the pursuit, already having been alerted by Cisco law enforcement. Eastland County Sheriff John Hart, his deputies, reporters, and the public were on high alert in the hunt for the fugitives. According to the Fort Worth Record-Telegram, search parties, including those on foot and horseback, scoured the unforgiving outskirts of Cisco with tracker dogs for any trace of the missing men. Aside from a suitcase containing first aid supplies, an overcoat, and blood-stained gloves, there was no sign of the gang. But back in Cisco, the news got worse. That evening, Chief Bedford died from his injuries, and Lewis, the only man in custody, was charged with murder and armed robbery. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Marshall, Henry, and Robert snuck back into Cisco and stole a Ford vehicle. 32-year-old Lewis Davis would never face justice for Chief Bedford's death, succumbing to his wounds and dying that evening. For all the efforts of law enforcement and the Cisco townspeople, no one received the reward as it couldn't be determined exactly who shot the man. Come Christmas Day, the robbers were still at large. But despite the need for reliable transportation, the trio wrecked the Ford just 13 miles west of Cisco, outside the town of Putnam. Needing another vehicle, around 1 a.m. on December 26th, they came upon the Wiley home, forcing 22-year-old Carl Wiley to drive them in his Dodge. Carl was shot in the arm as the group forced him at gunpoint to drive them away. Not by the bandits, but by his own desperate father. For almost another 24 hours, Carl was kept hostage by the men who didn't even offer him anything to eat. But they were much the worse for wear by now thanks to their gunshot wounds and lack of sleep, not to mention the worsening weather conditions, with sleet and icy plummeting temperatures making staying on the run near impossible. At 5 a.m. on December 27th, the men released Carl in his Dodge and stole a roadster, driving 55 miles north to South Bend in Young County. Carl told police he believed the men planned on returning to Wichita Falls. But the gang didn't plan on encountering Sheriff Foster, Deputy Sheriff Cy Bradford, and other officers in a roadblock at South Bend, thwarting their attempt to cross the Brazos River. A chase ensued, with Marshall, Henry, and Robert abandoning the roadster and fleeing on foot across an oil field. They fired back at law enforcement as they ran, with each man being injured in the shootout thanks to Deputy Bradford's double-barreled shotgun, nicknamed Old Betsy. Henry and Robert made their escape into the woods, but Marshall Ratliff was finally brought down. He was alive, but had 6 gunshot wounds, and was carrying 6 pistols in addition to a double-barreled shotgun, 3 belts of ammunition, and a Bowie knife. Despite an aerial search, there was no sign of Henry and Robert in the woodland, and the number of people wounded during the ongoing search continued to climb after 2 men, including a sheriff, were injured after their weapons were accidentally discharged. On the morning of December 30th, Henry Helms and Robert Hill were finally captured without incident in the town of Graham. Authorities were alerted by locals who took note of the fugitives' firearms and bedraggled appearance. By now, the men were so fatigued, dehydrated, and in need of medical attention, there was no point continuing to run. Between the 2 of them, they were carrying 7 pistols. According to the Associated Press, on January 27, 1928, 10 days after 60-year-old Deputy George Carmichael became the second lawman to succumb to his injuries, Marshall was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 99 years behind bars. Despite how traumatizing the experience of the robbery and shootout had been for young Laverne Comer and Woody Harris, it was their eyewitness evidence that helped convict the man disguised as Santa. Marshall's trial was the last ever to be held in the Eastland District Court's former courthouse, which was reduced to rubble following the conclusion of the proceedings. Henry, meanwhile, attempted to plead insanity in the lead up to his trial, but was prosecuted for killing Chief Bradford and Deputy Carmichael in February 1928 and was sentenced to death. At Robert's trial the following month, he pled guilty to armed robbery and begged the court for mercy, claiming his lack of a stable childhood home had led him to become involved with convicted felons. His pleas must have worked, because instead of death, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. By now, Marshall had received a further sentence. Despite there being no evidence that he had fired his gun out into the alley, he was convicted of killing Chief Bradford and Deputy Carmichael and was sentenced to death. On September 6, 1929, 32-year-old Henry Helms was executed in the electric chair in Huntsville. The same day, Marshall's mental health seemed to take a turn for the worse. A subsequent appeal against his death sentence had since been unsuccessful. After his attorney and mother applied for a sanity hearing, Marshall was extradited to Eastland County Jail for evaluation after a bench warrant was issued over his theft of the Oldsmobile. But the town's patience was wearing thin with the delay. They wanted to see Marshall executed swiftly. On November 18th, Marshall's health had supposedly deteriorated so rapidly that it took Deputy Sheriff Thomas Jones and jailer Edward Pack Kilbourne to help the convicted felon with basic tasks like eating and bathing. But Marshall's act was all a ruse. According to the Abilene News reporter, when Pack and Tom's backs were turned, Marshall snuck out his open cell door and stole a .38 pistol from an office desk drawer. In the resulting tussle with the officers, Marshall shot Deputy Jones multiple times, wounding him badly. Thankfully, Pack managed to overpower Marshall, who was rendered unconscious before being locked back in his cell. Pack subdued Marshall by pistol whipping him. By the following evening, 2,000 agitated Eastland County residents had gathered outside the jail, hoping that Deputy Tom Jones would pull through. Fueled by vigilantism and hell-bent on vengeance, a crowd of about 200 men stormed the jail, overpowering Pat Kilborn and dragging Marshall from his cell, stripping him naked and binding his hands and feet. Dragging him outside, the angry mob made their way 200 yards down the road to the rear of the Majestic Theater, which was, ironically, staging a production entitled The Noose. Someone produced a length of rope, and the hostile, jeering crowd proceeded to lynch 26-year-old Marshall Ratliff over a guy wire strung between two telephone poles 15 feet above the ground. Marshall had a brief reprieve when the rope broke, but another one was quickly found. The second time, there was no escape. After Marshall's corpse hung in the air for several hours, he was pronounced dead at 9:55 p.m. His body was laid out for all to see in an Eastland furniture store the next day until it was taken to the coroner. Sadly, 55-year-old Deputy Tom Jones didn't make it and died in the hospital the next day. Lynching was punishable by death in Texas, and Marshall's was said to be the last mob lynching in the state. But despite a grand jury being convened, no one was prosecuted. Marshall Ratliff's death brought the death toll from the robbery, including the gang, to 6, and 11 others had been wounded. The only member of the gang to survive was 22-year-old Robert Hill, who was released from prison in the mid-1940s after 3 unsuccessful escape attempts. There are mixed reports as to whether he changed his name, but it appears he faded into obscurity and a quiet life, dying in 1996 at age 90. Since 1967, the original First National Bank building has a plaque that was installed by the Texas Historical Commission. These days, while the former bank has moved premises, it features artwork depicting the infamous heist and even has a printed booklet available about the robbery. It's called the First Financial Bank now and is located on Conrad Hilton Boulevard. If you're interested in reading more about this fascinating chapter in Texas criminal history, you can check out The Santa Claus Robbery by A.C. Green and the 2023 novel The Last Man by Thomas Goodman. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Gemma Harris. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and click on the Listener Suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds, but it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm also on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, and Audible. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care, and Merry Christmas to those who celebrate.